We always argue about nature and nurture, and we talk about genetic mutations, gene-protein regulatory networks, gene recombination, conversion, drift, and shift as part of our genetics. But now, we know that there's a way for nature to impact, for nurture to impact on nature through the environment, through influences in the environment that could be incorporated into your genes through epigenetics. And therefore, there is a molecular basis for training, for adaptation, and for education. And this answers the issue of the detractors about gradualism versus saltation. Also highlights the importance of molecular and morphological diversity. So now comes our relating these principles to social and institutional change. We know that we can represent natural phenomena in logarithmic time and space scales, and there is a logarithmic growth of knowledge, including knowledge of organized, sensitive, progressive, productive systems, knowledge of biological systems which are complex, dynamical, controlled, adaptive, intelligent systems. And evolution offers insights for progressive change of intelligent social systems such as human institutions. So I represented it this way as 3D space, where you can actually think of all of these natural phenomena in terms of different increments of time and space. There's just so much knowledge out there, not just of humans, but of the whole of nature. So how does this apply to the university? So this is my special slide, scheme that I made when I joined administration. And here we can see a complex system with different elements, components, influences, inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And this is very general. What most important here would be the agents, and what are the agents that can be controlling, and would say that the most important agents would be the humans who are represented here on the left. Now, what are the applicable principles from biology that we could use in social institutional change? This is just a summary of some of the things I talked about from biology. Physical, chemical change, entropy versus energy, order versus disorder, reversible reactions, meaning you can have a system that shifts between two behaviors like hemoglobin. You could have coupled and reversible reactions. Energetics, which is path independent. Those are our stones, our foundations, and the kinetics would be, the ways we could change and grow like seeds. Biomolecular and biological change, I talked about all of these. The importance of creating niches or spaces, the hierarchy of ordered structures, organization, which then leads to intelligent organization, self-organization and intelligent design, cooperative function, sigmoidicity and switching, reversibility, same, in chemical and biological, feedback looping and control, metabolic coupling, catalytic change and turnover, amplification and cross-talking. Then for evolution, we have the principles on the level of morphology and on the level of molecules. So I'd like to end with a slide and say that we could think of general strategies, and this would entail a balance between competition and cooperation, and also between knowing ourselves and protecting our interests, this is our biology, and also interacting with our environment, which is our ecology. This issue is important now because we are moving the university to internationalization, and we'd like to use the word internationalism. So there should not be a conflict between our nationalism and our internationalization. It is also calls us to a good attitude or value of humility and pride. And when I say humility, we don't just learn from amongst us, from among humans. There's so much to learn from the rest of nature, because man is part of nature. Okay? Of course, we have our pride because we are the most intelligent organisms in nature. So I think all of these can be looked at in the light of the goals of the university, which should be academic excellence and operational excellence. So I'd like to thank those who contributed to my talk, terms of the materials and the ideas. Neda, who's a PhD student working on CONUS, and Professor Nick, Helen Yap, I've had lots of discussions with. She and Ed Padlan would teach this course to non-biologists. It's called Biological Structures, and we had many physicists and computer scientists look at this complex dynamical systems. And I'd like to thank my mentor. This is Concepcion Dadufalsa, University Professor Emeritus of the university. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Giselle. Again, there'll be time for questions in the open forum. May I then invite Professor Neil Garcia. You're next.
Okay, so my talk's title is The Literary Practice of Complexity, and it will be about the two practices that I engage in, which are criticism and poetry. And both of them deal with the idea of complexity in various ways. What I've decided to do is to actually render in PowerPoint form what I will be reading, so that in case my voice is insufficient and you can't quite follow it, you'll be able to follow it just reading the text on the PowerPoint. Complexity in literary criticism is a consequence of the interplay of elements in the production of meaning. Because literature is communication, it is necessarily comprised of the following: a message, which is called the text, a sender, called the author, a receiver, the reader, code, the language in which the text is couched, and finally, a reality, world, or context within which the signifying activity is taking place. So this is a communication model with exactly those elements as I mentioned them. Meaning in literature is a function of the set of assumptions, which is to say the theory that one brings to bear on it. Roughly, we can classify literary theories into the following. Mimetic theories emphasize literature's link to reality. Expressive theories emphasize literature's link to its author. Pragmatic theories stress literature's relationship with its audience. And formalist theories stress literature's uniqueness as an object of study. Most contemporary literary theories demonstrate the limitations of this model by raising mimetic, pragmatic, formalist, and expressive questions about literature all at once. These theories also view language not as a transparent and referential medium, but rather as an interested mediation and a cultural force that in fact constitutes all the components of this grid. Literary complexity arises from there being many factors, all of them multifaceted, that come into play every time meaning is intended, expressed, shaped, disseminated, interpreted, and situated. What makes literature complex is the multiplicity of possible readings premised on varying degrees of emphasis on literature's different structural elements that these different approaches to the text occasion. Let me just speak about one particular theory, which is post-structuralism, and the critical procedure associated with it, which is deconstruction. Post-structuralism emerged among the French intelligentsia as a reaction against the mechanistic tendency of structuralism. Structuralism's central intuition that there are implicit patterns of organization that underlie things, and that these structures are not objectively present in reality, but are rather the imputations of human ways of perceiving, thinking, and making sense of experience, can be traced to the linguistic turn as it was effected by the work of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. In a series of lectures, Saussure argued that instead of merely recording or naming, language actually constitutes our world. For example, the words for colors make them real, rather than merely label them. As such, language constitutes all thought, even as it cannot directly reflect the world, for it is merely a system of unmotivated signs which produce meaning by virtue of these signs' differential relations with one another. Because the system is closed, the links between signs and their reference in the outside world are arbitrary and entirely conventional. The Saussurean idea that language is arbitrary, relational, and constitutive is central to the project of structuralist critics, who regard human phenomena in terms of systems that are self-contained, in which individual elements are relational and thus interconnected in structures of increasing complexity. Post-structuralism pursues the structuralist insight on the constitutive role that language plays in creating reality and takes it to its utmost logical implication. Since everything is mediated linguistically, then there exists no objectively real, self-evident, fixed, or certain entity upon which to anchor meaning. Hence, unlike structuralism, which seeks to arrive at a scientific knowledge of language and signification through intensive data gathering, post-structuralism eschews all kinds of systems analysis, arguing that there are only interpretations and that there are no unmediated facts. Deconstruction, a key interpretive procedure employed by post-structuralists, derives from the notion of slipping or indeterminacy, which underlies language and certainly all linguistic phenomena like literature. As Saussurian linguistics first clarified, the elements of signification, namely the concrete signifier, the abstract signified, and the referent, which the sign serves to indicate, are related to each other only arbitrarily and therefore unstably. Signifiers refer only to other signifiers in a chain of slippery associations in which no final and positive term, a transcendental signified, ever appears to stabilize the indeterminacy of the signification process. Being textuality, language slips in relation to itself as well as to the world. We might say that the key marker for complexity in post-structuralist theory is the notion of difference. As a critical term, difference denotes not only the differential play of meaning inherent in language, but also the situation and the very being of bodies and entities that exist in space and time. It is for these two reasons that the deconstructive emphasis on difference has lent itself well to a variety of social-political advocacies. How to deconstruct? This is very reductive. It's boiled down, but basically what you do when you deconstruct is you identify the text's key opposition, and where it proves most unstable, you reverse the binary. This form of close reading demonstrates how the binary subordinate or inferior term is actually indispensable and prior to the first or privileged term. An example of this is culture, which is typically devalued in relation to nature. Deconstruction argues that culture is actually what defines and names nature, and thus cannot be simply inferior or subordinate to it. To reinscribe the terms of binaries, the reader must therefore transvaluate and transform the common understanding and hierarchy of these concepts. It is important to remember that the notion of deconstruction doesn't deny the possibility of meaning. As a method of interpretation, it merely denies the dominance of any one interpretation and shifts things away from the question of whether the reading is correct, definitive, or true, towards the question of whether the reading is convincing, useful, and productive. This makes the deconstructive procedure, far from being obscure, quite immediate and pragmatic. Beyond the philosophical premises upon which it rests, as a method of textual analysis, deconstruction is being deployed most excitingly and most usefully in conjunction with feminism, psychoanalysis, and cultural studies, in order to address the questions of oppressive difference in terms of gender, culture, sexuality, race, etc.